700 men faced 40,000. The defenders had no hope of reinforcement. The attackers had the most powerful empire on earth behind them. Yet when the smoke cleared after 112 days of hell, it was the empire that retreated in terror, leaving 10,000 corpses behind. On August 18th, 1565, a 71-year-old man picked up a pike and charged into a breach filled with Ottoman elite troops. The fate of Christian Europe hung by a thread on a tiny Mediterranean island. By the end of this video, you'll understand how 700 knights turned human heads into cannonballs, why the Ottoman Empire's most elite troops fled in terror, and how one man's iron will change the course of history. But here's where it gets insane. This wasn't just a battle between armies. It was a descent into psychological warfare so extreme that both sides abandoned every rule of civilized combat. Hardened Ottoman veterans who had conquered nations would flee Malta in panic. Why? Because the Knights of St. John had transformed warfare itself into a weapon of terror. What happened next defied all logic. The defenders, outnumbered 50-1, didn't just survive for over 3 months. They broke the most powerful military force on earth. And they did it through methods so brutal that chroniclers on both sides tried to erase them from history. If Malta fell, Rome would be next. The Pope himself declared that the island's loss would mean the end of Christianity in the Mediterranean. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had already conquered Belgrade, Rhodes, and Hungary. His armies seemed unstoppable. His fleet ruled the seas. Malta was supposed to be easy. Then something happened that nobody expected. An old man's refusal to surrender would cost the Ottoman Empire 25,000 of its finest warriors. The siege that was meant to last 2 weeks stretched into 4 months of unimaginable horror. And at its climax, when defeat seemed certain, the knights would commit an act of psychological warfare that still shocks historians today. To understand how we got to this moment of madness, let me set the stage. If you're fascinated by history's most brutal sieges, where the impossible becomes reality, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Ring the bell to witness how outnumbered defenders changed history. Now, let me take you back to May 18th, 1565, when 193 Ottoman warships appeared on Malta's horizon. The story begins 43 years earlier, in 1522, when the Knights of St. John suffered their greatest humiliation. After a 6-month siege, Sultan Suleiman's father had driven them from Rhodes, their home for over 200 years. The warrior monks sailed away defeated, searching for a new base. In 1530, they settled on Malta, a barren rock that nobody else wanted. But this barren rock would become the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Mediterranean. From Malta, the knights could strike Ottoman shipping lanes, raid Muslim coasts, and protect Christian merchants. They turned piracy into a holy mission, capturing Muslim vessels and enslaving their crews. By 1565, 3,000 Muslim slaves labored in Malta's galleys and fortifications. This is where the story takes a dark turn. The man who would lead Malta's defense understood suffering intimately. Jean Parisot de Valette had been captured by Ottoman corsairs in 1541. For 1 year, he pulled an oar as a galley slave, chained to his bench, whipped daily, watching men die beside him. When finally ransomed, he returned to the knights with one purpose: revenge against the Ottoman Empire. By 1565, at age 71, Valette had become Grand Master of the Order. He stood 6 feet tall, in an age when most men barely reached 5'6". His presence alone could silence a room. Knights from 8 different nations — French, Spanish, Italian, German, Portuguese, English, Provençal, and Auvergnat — all bowed to his iron will. What the Ottomans didn't realize was that they were sailing into a trap 8 years in the making. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire had reached its absolute zenith under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. His dominions stretched from Budapest to Baghdad, from Crimea to Yemen. His armies had never met their match. His titles included Lord of the Two Lands and Two Seas and Shadow of God on Earth. At 70 years old, Suleiman wanted one final triumph: the destruction of the knights who had humiliated Islam for centuries. He chose his commanders carefully. Mustafa Pasha, known as the Sultan's executioner, had crushed rebellions from Egypt to Anatolia. His reputation for brutality preceded him. Entire cities had surrendered rather than face his wrath. The second commander would be even more feared: Dragut, called the Drawn Sword of Islam, the greatest Muslim corsair alive, who knew every inlet and current around Malta. But Valette had something they didn't expect. For 8 years, He'd been transforming Malta into a death trap. Every approach had been mapped. Every potential landing site had been fortified. Secret tunnels connected the fortresses. Most importantly, Valette had built the finest intelligence network in the Mediterranean. Months before the Ottoman fleet sailed, his spies in Constantinople warned him of the exact numbers: 193 ships, 30,000 soldiers, 15,000 sailors and support troops. The knights controlled three main fortresses, arranged around Malta's Grand Harbour. Fort Street Elmo guarded the entrance, while Fort Street Angelo and Fort Street Michael protected the two peninsulas of Birgu and Senglia. Between them lay the most strategic harbour in the Mediterranean. When Ottoman scouts reported Malta's defences in early 1565, they laughed. 700 knights and 6,000 Maltese militia against the empire's might? They would soon learn their mistake. On the Ottoman side, the numbers alone should have guaranteed victory. The armada of 193 vessels included 131 royal galleys, 11 massive cargo ships, and numerous smaller craft. This floating city carried 30,000 to 40,000 of the empire's finest warriors. Leading them were the legendary Janissaries, Christian boys taken as children, converted to Islam, and transformed into the most disciplined soldiers on earth. These men lived only for war, forbidden to marry, trained from childhood in the arts of killing. But here's where it gets insane. The Janissaries wore distinctive white felt caps and carried the newest military technology, arquebuses that could punch through armor at 100 yards. Behind them came the Sipahi, elite cavalry adapted for siege warfare, and thousands of irregular troops from across the empire: Anatolians, Syrians, Albanians, and North African corsairs. The fleet also carried master engineers, miners who could tunnel under any wall, and artillery specialists with 80 massive siege guns. What happened next defied all logic. Against this host stood 700 knights from Europe's noblest families. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Each knight had trained since adolescence in swordsmanship, horsemanship, and combat tactics. They wore 60 pounds of plate armor, even in Malta's blazing heat. Their code demanded death before dishonor. Supporting them were 6,000 Maltese militia, farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen who knew every stone of their island. What they lacked in training, they made up for in desperation. This was their home, their families sheltered behind those walls. The Fortress Trinity presented a formidable challenge despite the numbers. Fort Street Elmo might have been small, but its star-shaped design meant attackers would face crossfire from every angle. Street Angelo, the Knights' headquarters, had walls 30 feet thick at the base. Street Michael protected Senglia with overlapping fields of fire. Valette had spent 8 years perfecting these defenses. Then something happened that nobody expected. In the months before the siege, Valette transformed Malta into a weapon. He ordered the harvesting of all crops, poisoned wells outside the fortresses, and demolished every building that could shelter the enemy. He prepared fire hoops, wooden rings soaked in pitch and wildfire that could be lit and rolled down on attackers. Massive cauldrons were positioned on the walls for boiling water mixed with quicklime. Most ingeniously, he created a network of underground tunnels where his men could move unseen between strong points. But Valette had one more card to play. His intelligence network had provided exact details of Ottoman preparations. He knew about their siege equipment, their ammunition supplies, even their water requirements. This knowledge led to a crucial decision. He reinforced Fort Street Elmo with 600 of his best men, knowing it would fall but calculating it would bleed the Ottoman army. The pre-siege provocations revealed the hatred between these forces. When Muslim slaves in Malta learned of the approaching fleet, some attempted to escape. Valette's response shocked even his own knights. He ordered them crucified on the walls of Fort Street Angelo, facing the sea where the Ottoman fleet would arrive. This is where the siege became something else entirely. Word of this atrocity reached the Ottoman fleet. Mustafa Pasha reportedly told his officers, "The Christians have signed their death warrant. We will feed every night to the fish and enslave every Maltese man, woman, and child." The rules of civilized warfare had already been abandoned, and not a shot had been fired. But the real shock was still to come. As final preparations continued, both sides performed their rituals. The knights attended Mass in the Church of St. Lawrence, taking communion and confessing their sins. Each man knew the odds. Across the water, the call to prayer echoed from 193 ships as Ottoman warriors prepared for holy war. The Janissaries sharpened their scimitars while chanting verses from the Quran. On May 18th, when those 193 ships appeared, Every church bell on Malta rang in terror. Women grabbed their children and ran for the fortress walls. Old men, who remembered the Corsair raids, crossed themselves and prepared to die. The apocalypse had arrived. May 18th, 1565, dawn broke to reveal the sea itself transformed into an Ottoman city. The invasion fleet stretched beyond the horizon, their green banners and horsehair standards catching the morning light. From the walls of Street Elmo, a knight counted over 180 sails before losing track. The sound reached them first, drums beating in rhythm with the oars, the call to prayer from dozens of ships, creating a wall of sound that made the limestone fortifications tremble. But Valette had something they didn't expect. He ordered his knights to remain silent. No bells, no trumpets, no response to the Ottoman display. This eerie quiet unnerved the invaders more than any battle cry. As the massive fleet rounded the island seeking an anchorage, they found every suitable beach fortified, every water source destroyed. Valette's 8 years of preparation were about to pay off. The Ottomans finally anchored at Marsaxlokk Bay on May 20th. The disembarkation took 2 full days. Imagine 40,000 men, their equipment, horses, and massive siege guns being unloaded on a hostile shore. Maltese cavalry skirmished with the landing parties, killing dozens before melting away. These hit-and-run tactics forced the Ottomans to deploy in full battle order just to unload their ships. What happened next defied all logic. On May 23rd, the Ottoman War Council made a decision that would shape the entire siege. Military logic dictated attacking the weakest fortresses first, Burgu and Senglia, but Mustafa Pasha, influenced by his engineers, chose to assault Fort Street. Elmo, take the key to the harbour, they argued, and the rest will fall. This miscalculation would cost them dearly. Valette received this intelligence within hours. His response stunned his own council. Reinforce Street Elmo immediately. Send 600 of the best knights and soldiers across the harbour under cover of darkness. His commanders protested. Street Elmo would fall eventually. Why waste men? Valette's answer revealed his brutal strategy. Every day Street Elmo holds cost the enemy hundreds of men they cannot replace. We can be reinforced. They cannot. Then something happened that nobody expected. May 24th witnessed the first great bombardment. The Ottomans had dragged 24 massive siege guns onto Mount Sybaris, overlooking Street Elmo. At dawn, they opened fire. 6,000 cannonballs struck the fort in a single day. The sound was apocalyptic, continuous thunder that could be heard 20 miles away. Limestone dust rose in clouds so thick that gunners couldn't see their targets. The fort's walls, built to medieval specifications, began to crumble. But then came the sound that changed everything. On May 25th, Dragut arrived with 1,500 corsairs and 15 more galleys. The drawn sword of Islam had fought Christians for 40 years. He knew Malta's waters intimately. His first action was to inspect the siege lines and explode in rage. You've wasted a week and hundreds of men for nothing. Street Elmo should have been taken in 3 days. He repositioned the batteries, bringing guns to bear on the fort's weakest points. This is where legend and history blur. The knights responded with tactics that seemed insane. Each night, swimming parties crossed the harbour in darkness. These men, volunteers all, carried primitive explosives and Greek fire. They swam 200 yards through water patrolled by Ottoman boats, planted their charges against enemy positions, and swam back under arrow fire. Not all returned. Their bodies washed up on the rocks at dawn. The horror of Street Elmo's bombardment defied description. By June 3rd, the fort's walls had been reduced from 20 feet to rubble in places. Knights stood behind barriers made from the corpses of their brothers, packed with earth and stones. The June heat, over 100 degrees, turned the confined space into an oven. Men fainted from heat exhaustion while fighting, but the real shock was still to come. Daily casualty rates shocked both sides. For every knight who fell, 100 Ottomans died assaulting the breaches. The Star Fort's design created killing fields where attackers faced fire from 3 directions. Ottoman elite troops, men who had conquered cities across 3 continents, were mowed down by Maltese farmers with arquebuses. June 10th brought a moment that changed the siege's character. During a massive assault, Ottoman troops finally gained the outer works. As they poured in, convinced of victory, hidden knights emerged from tunnels, surrounding the attackers. The slaughter was absolute. Mustafa watched from his command post as his best troops were annihilated. His comment became legendary. If so small a son costs so dear, what will the father cost? But first, they had to survive the night. By June 23rd, Fort Street Elmo's final day, the walls existed only in memory. The defenders, reduced to 100 men still able to fight, knew the end had come. They took final communion, put on their finest armor, and prepared to die. The last assault began at dawn, with 4,000 Janissaries attacking simultaneously from all sides. The aftermath was worse than the battle. When Mustafa Pasha walked through Street Elmo's ruins that afternoon, he found 1,500 Ottoman dead among the 600 Christian corpses. The fort that should have fallen in 3 days had held for 31 days, costing him 8,000 men, 1/4 of his army. His rage exploded into an act that would seal both armies' fates. The Ottoman rage transformed into something monstrous. Mustafa ordered the wounded knights who survived Street Elmo to be brought before him. These men, expecting the honorable treatment due to brave enemies, instead faced horror. Ottoman soldiers tore their hearts from their living bodies while they still breathed. But that wasn't enough for Mustafa's fury. He ordered the knights' corpses beheaded, their bodies lashed to wooden crosses in mockery of their faith. What followed would shatter every rule of warfare. On the morning of June 24th, these makeshift crucifixes were floated across the Grand Harbour toward Fort Street Angelo. The current carried them slowly, a grotesque flotilla bearing Valet's brothers. Maltese fishermen wept as they pulled the bodies from the water. The entire population watched from the walls as their defenders were retrieved. But then, Valet gave an order that shocked even his own knights. Within the hour, every Ottoman prisoner in Malta, men who had been kept for ransom according to the customs of war, was dragged to the walls of Street Angelo. Valet himself supervised as each was beheaded, but he wasn't finished. The Grand Master ordered the heads loaded into his largest cannons. That afternoon, Ottoman troops besieging Burgu heard the boom of artillery. Instead of stone cannonballs, human heads rained down on their positions. This is where the siege took its darkest turn. The psychological impact was devastating. Ottoman soldiers, already shaken by their losses at Street Elmo, now faced an enemy who had abandoned all restraint. The heads of their comrades, staring sightlessly from the dirt, broke something in the Ottoman ranks. Mustafa had wanted to terrorize the Christians. Instead, he had created demons. From this moment, Valet announced to his knights, "We show no mercy. They wanted war without rules. Now they have it." July brought the full weight of Ottoman power against Burgu and Senglia. Mustafa positioned 80 siege guns on the heights, creating a crossfire that could pulverize the ancient walls. The bombardment began July 2nd with a fury that dwarfed Street Elmo. Contemporary accounts describe the sound as the breaking of the world. In July alone, 130,000 cannonballs would strike the Christian fortresses. But here's where it gets insane. The tunnel war began immediately. Ottoman engineers, masters of siege mining, began digging toward the walls. Their plan: pack gunpowder beneath the fortifications and blow breaches from below. But Valet had anticipated this. Maltese miners, men who knew the island's rock intimately, dug counter-tunnels. Deep beneath Malta, a second war raged in darkness. What happened next defied belief. These underground battles were knife fights in spaces barely wide enough for one man. Miners broke through into enemy tunnels, fighting with picks and daggers in absolute darkness. Men drowned in underground water pockets. Others suffocated when tunnels collapsed. The Maltese developed a terrifying tactic. They would break small holes into Ottoman tunnels and pump in smoke mixed with sulfur and quicklime. The harbour itself became a battlefield. Ottoman swimmers attempted to place explosives against the harbour walls. Christian swimmers hunted them in the dark water. These aquatic duels happened nightly, men grappling beneath the surface, drowning each other in silence, while the siege raged above. On July 15th, something emerged from the Ottoman lines that had never been seen in European warfare. A massive siege tower, 30 feet tall and sheathed in wet hides to resist fire, began rolling towards Senglia's walls. Inside, elite Janissaries waited to pour onto the ramparts. The defenders watched in horror as this wooden mountain approached, seemingly unstoppable. But the real horror was about to begin. Maltese women refused to cower. They appeared on the walls carrying cauldrons of boiling water mixed with cooking oil. As Janissaries climbed the tower's ladders, these civilian defenders poured death from above. The screams of men being boiled alive in their armor echoed across the battlefield. But the tower kept coming, pushed by hundreds of men. Valet had one last card to play against the tower. Hidden in Street Angelo, his artillery masters had been calculating ranges for weeks. As the siege tower reached the walls, Valet's concealed battery opened fire. The first salvo missed, The second struck home. Cannonballs tore through the tower's structure, sending wood splinters the size of spears through packed ranks of janissaries. Then came the moment no one could have predicted. A knight named Zanogera had prepared a special weapon, a fire hoop 10 feet in diameter, soaked in Greek fire. As the damaged tower swayed, he lit the hoop and rolled it off the wall. The flaming ring struck the tower's base, igniting the tar-soaked wood. Within minutes, the entire structure became a pillar of flame with men still inside. The tower's destruction triggered the first major assault. 8,000 Ottoman troops surged forward, convinced that the Christians were weakening. They faced something unprecedented: concentrated firepower from multiple angles. Street Angelo's guns fired into their flanks, while Senglia's defenders poured arquebus fire from above. Numbers don't tell the real story. The assault lasted 6 hours. When Ottoman trumpets finally sounded retreat, 4,000 attackers lay dead or dying. The moat before Senglia's walls literally overflowed with bodies. Defenders used long poles to push corpses aside to clear fields of fire. The stench in Malta's summer heat became unbearable. Both sides fought with cloths tied over their faces. This is when the rules of warfare were thrown away. Mustafa realized conventional tactics weren't working. His enemy fought like cornered demons, turning every assault into a massacre. He needed to break their spirit. The psychological warfare would escalate beyond anything seen in European conflict. August 7th dawned with an ominous silence. No bombardment, no movement in Ottoman lines. Defenders knew this meant only one thing: a general assault was coming. At 8 a.m., the storm broke. 8,000 janissaries attacked simultaneously, 4,000 against Birgu, 4,000 against Senglia. This wasn't a probe or demonstration. Mustafa had committed his elite reserves. What emerged from that breach defied belief. The Senglia assault included something new: a coordinated water attack. Ottoman troops had lashed boats together, creating floating bridges. While defenders focused on the land walls, 1,000 troops crossed the harbour to attack from the water. For the first time, Christians faced assault from 2 directions. But Valette had something they didn't expect. He had anticipated this move weeks earlier. A hidden battery on Street Angelo, positioned to fire across the harbour, waited for this moment. As Ottoman boats packed with troops reached Senglia's water walls, the guns opened fire. Cannonballs skipped across the water like stones, smashing through multiple boats. The harbour turned red as hundreds drowned in their armour. Then Valette played his masterstroke. A small force of cavalry, kept hidden in Medina, Malta's old capital, suddenly appeared on the heights above the Ottoman camp. In reality, it was only 200 horsemen, but they carried multiple banners and raised enough dust for 1,000. Someone in the Ottoman ranks shouted that the Spanish relief force had arrived. History pivoted on what happened next. Panic spreads faster than plague in an army. Ottoman troops, exhausted from hours of assault, heard Spanish reinforcements and began falling back. What started as a tactical withdrawal became a rout. Janissaries, the empire's finest soldiers, ran from a phantom army. The assault collapsed. The cost of victory was about to be revealed. When the dust settled, 2,500 elite Ottoman troops lay dead in just 6 hours. Mustafa's army was bleeding to death against Malta's walls. But the Christians had paid too. Barely 3,000 defenders remained standing. Ammunition ran low, food supplies dwindled. Both armies were dying on their feet. Then came August 18th, the day that would define the siege. Dawn on August 18th brought the explosion everyone had dreaded. Ottoman miners had finally succeeded. A massive blast tore open Birgu's Castile bastion, creating a breach 50 feet wide. Through the dust and smoke, defenders saw their nightmare: thousands of fresh Ottoman troops massing for the final assault. In that moment, the siege transformed into something else entirely. The Ottoman battle cry, "The city is taken," echoed through the breach as elite troops poured in. Defenders fell back, overwhelmed by numbers. For the first time in the siege, Ottoman banners appeared inside the walls. Panic spread through the Christian ranks. Women and children ran screaming through the streets. The end seemed moments away, but then came the sound that changed everything. A war cry cut through the chaos. "Follow me, sons of Street John." Jean de Valette himself, 71 years old, appeared in the breach. He wore only a light helmet, carrying a pike like a common soldier. Behind him ran his personal guard, but the Grand Master outpaced them all, charging directly into the Ottoman ranks. What the Ottomans saw next broke their spirit. A grenade exploded near Valette, driving metal splinters into his leg. Blood soaked through his boots. His guards tried to pull him back. The old man shook them off and pressed forward. his pike finding Ottoman throats. Seeing their Grand Master fighting in the breach, every Christian who could hold a weapon surged forward. Knights, soldiers, Maltese civilians, even women with kitchen knives joined the counterattack. The next 60 seconds would determine Europe's fate. The breach became a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled so high that men fought standing on corpses. Valette, bleeding from multiple wounds, refused to retreat. His presence transformed farmers into heroes. A Maltese blacksmith, wielding his hammer, crushed a Janissary commander's skull. A woman threw a pot of boiling soup into an attacker's face. But Valette's greatest gamble was yet to come. As Ottomans wavered, Valette ordered something unprecedented. The heads collected from Ottoman dead were loaded into cannons positioned behind the breach. When these guns fired, Ottoman reinforcements advancing toward the breach saw their comrades' heads bouncing toward them. The psychological destruction was complete. Elite warriors who had conquered cities across 3 continents broke and ran from a breach they had already taken. By late August, both armies faced an enemy worse than combat: disease. The thousands of unburied corpses in Malta's heat created a pestilence that killed indiscriminately. Dysentery swept through the Ottoman camp, claiming 100 men daily. The Christians fared no better. Water supplies, contaminated with bodies and waste, became poison. But the real shock was still to come. Food had vanished on both sides. The Maltese ate rats, cats, and leather belts. They ground limestone into powder and mixed it with the last drops of olive oil. Children grew too weak to cry. In the Ottoman camp, supply ships delayed by weather left soldiers gnawing on leather shield covers. Horses, then donkeys, then dogs disappeared into cooking pots. What happened next stunned both armies. The morning sick call revealed the siege's true horror. Of 40,000 Ottoman troops who had landed, barely 15,000 remained combat effective. The rest lay sick, wounded, or dead. Hospital tents overflowed. Surgeons ran out of supplies and resorted to cauterizing wounds with heated sword blades. Men begged for death rather than endure the heat, thirst, and flies. On the Christian side, the morning muster showed fewer than 600 knights still standing. The Maltese militia had been reduced to 2,000 exhausted men. Ammunition was nearly gone. Defenders collected Ottoman arrows and cannonballs to fire back. Valette ordered the last food reserves distributed, 1 cup of wine and a handful of grain per man. September arrived, with Mustafa facing an impossible choice. His army was disintegrating, but retreat meant facing Sultan Suleiman's wrath. On September 1st, he ordered what he swore would be the final assault. Every man who could still walk would attack. Victory or death. No other option remained. But Valette had one more card to play. The Grand Master spread a rumor through his Maltese spies. A relief force was days away. Let the Ottomans intercept this intelligence. Whether Mustafa believed it or not, it added urgency to his attacks. The September assaults took on a desperate quality. Human wave attacks with no tactical finesse, just raw numbers thrown at the walls. Then came the miracle of timing. On September 6th, as another Ottoman assault crashed against Birgu's walls, sails appeared on the horizon. Don Garcia de Toledo, Viceroy of Sicily, had finally assembled a relief force. After months of delays and excuses, 9,000 fresh Spanish troops were approaching Malta. The timing seemed divinely ordained. 1 week later would have been too late. What followed would haunt Ottoman soldiers for generations. Mustafa held a council of war that night. His generals reported the truth. They had less than 10,000 effective soldiers left. The Janissaries, his elite corps, had been reduced by 75%. Continuing meant certain annihilation, but retreat with a fresh Christian army landing meant running a gauntlet of vengeance. The decision came at dawn. Ottoman trumpets sounded not for attack, but withdrawal. The sight from Malta's walls was surreal. The army that had terrorized the Mediterranean for months was running. Tents abandoned, siege guns left behind, supplies scattered. The invincible Ottoman war machine had become a mob fleeing for the ships. But numbers don't tell the real story. As word spread, every Maltese who could walk grabbed whatever weapon they could find. The hunters became the hunted. Maltese cavalry, held in reserve for months, rode down fleeing Ottomans. The retreat became a massacre. September 11th witnessed scenes of apocalyptic horror. The bay where Ottomans had landed confidently 4 months earlier became a charnel house. Desperate soldiers fought each other for places on boats. Officers used swords to keep order. Overloaded vessels capsized, drowning hundreds. The Maltese showed no mercy. This was vengeance. for their destroyed homes, dead families, and months of terror. The Bay of Corpses told the final statistics. Conservative estimates placed Ottoman dead at 25,000 to 30,000, including camp followers. The cream of the empire's military lay rotting under Malta's sun. Among the dead, 3/4 of the Janissary Corps, dozens of senior commanders, thousands of specialist engineers and artillerymen who couldn't be easily replaced. Christian losses, while proportionally severe, told a different story. Of the original 700 knights, perhaps 250 survived. The Maltese had lost 7,000 people, fighters and civilians, but they had kept their freedom and faith. The island that was supposed to fall in 2 weeks had devoured an empire's ambitions. But then came the moment no one could have predicted. Mustafa Pasha, boarding his flagship, turned for one last look at Malta. Witnesses reported he wept, whether from shame, rage, or relief, none could say. His parting words became legendary. "I swear by Allah's name, we will return and turn every stone of this cursed island to dust." He would face Suleiman's fury, but he had survived. Thousands of his men had not. In Burgu, Valette stood on the walls watching the Ottoman fleet shrink toward the horizon. His leg wounds had barely closed. His body bore dozens of scars from the siege, but he lived, and Malta stood. His victory speech was brief but prophetic. "We have bought Christianity a generation of peace. They will return, but we will be ready." Today, the cross has triumphed over the crescent, but the battle's end was just the beginning of Malta's transformation. The Ottoman expansion in the Mediterranean died on Malta's walls. Never again would Ottoman fleets threaten Italy or Spain with the same confidence. The psychological impact rippled across Europe. If 700 knights could stop 40,000 Ottomans, perhaps the Turkish tide could be turned. Church bells rang from London to Vienna, celebrating Christianity's survival. But here's where it gets insane. Sultan Suleiman received Mustafa's report in Constantinople with volcanic fury. The man who had conquered much of Europe and the Middle East couldn't accept defeat by a handful of knights. He began planning an even larger expedition for 1566, swearing to lead it personally. But age and grief took their toll. Suleiman the Magnificent died on September 6, 1566, exactly 1 year after his fleet fled Malta. Some said he died of shame. The knight's reputation transformed overnight. From being seen as an anachronistic relic of the Crusades, they became Christianity's premier warriors. Donations poured in from every Catholic nation. Young nobles competed to join the order. The knights who had arrived in Malta as refugees left it as legends. In March 1566, Valette laid the foundation stone for a new city. This wouldn't be another medieval fortress, but a Renaissance masterpiece, the first planned city of the modern era. Every street was designed for defense, every building a potential strongpoint. If the Ottomans returned, they would face not scattered fortresses, but an integrated death trap. Valette personally supervised every detail, from the angle of bastions to the width of streets. Despite his wounds never fully healing, he worked 18-hour days. On August 21st, 1568, the Iron Grand Master died of a stroke, possibly brought on by his siege injuries. He was buried in the city that would bear his name, Valletta, eternal monument to an impossible victory. The Great Siege of Malta marked a turning point in military history. The concentrated firepower defense, the integrated fortress system, the psychological warfare, all became models for future conflicts. Military academies still study Valette's tactics. The siege proved that determination and terrain could defeat overwhelming numbers. This is where legend and history blur. The Ottoman naval power never fully recovered its confidence. At Lepanto, in 1571, when Christian and Ottoman fleets met in the Mediterranean's last great galley battle, the memory of Malta haunted Turkish commanders. They had learned that Christians could fight with the same fanaticism as Ghazis. Modern parallels abound. Whenever a small force faces impossible odds, whether at Rorke's Drift, the Alamo, or Stalingrad, Malta provides the template. The siege entered popular culture as the epitome of defiant resistance. Remember, Malta became a battle cry for underdogs everywhere. 700 men had indeed faced 40,000. Through brutality, brilliance, and sheer will, they had achieved the impossible. The heads fired from cannons became a symbol not of barbarity, but of the lengths men will go to defend their world. In 112 days, a handful of knights had changed history's course. The cross had defeated the crescent through methods that shocked both sides. Sometimes, when civilization itself is at stake, heroes and monsters become indistinguishable.